She was the most scandalous swindler of her time. The teacher of this woman was Count Cagliostro himself, and the King of France, the Queen, and the Cardinal became victims of her intrigues in the 18th century. It was because of her that the great bourgeois revolution began in the country. Then the whole world knew her as Milady Winter, the heroine of Alexandre Dumas' novel, The Three Musketeers.
Lady Winter, Countess de la Fère, Anne de Belle, Charlotte Buxton, Baroness Sheffield. The devil gave this woman 1,000 names. But everyone knows her as Milady, a character in Dumas' novel. In The Three Musketeers, she died under the executioner's axe. Dumas never found out that in fact his heroine lived to a very old age and died in the Crimea.
What was this woman hiding? Why did she flee to Crimea? We will learn the true story of the sinister con artist, find her grave, and finally discover the secret of Milady's life. It turns out that Alexandre Dumas hid her real name. This woman's name was Jeanne de Lamotte. She was never a beauty, and she never spied for the cardinal. However, on the shoulder of the French swindler, there really was a stigma in the form of a lily. And also, she had the ability to bring misfortune to everyone with whom her fate crossed. The real Milady did not die under the executioner's axe. She survived her enemies and died at a very old age in the Crimea. Why did the writer hide Milady's name and not want to reveal the real heroes of his famous novel to the world?
In real life, Dumas' heroes were different. Queen Anne of Austria is ugly. Her husband Louis is stupid. Cardinal Richelieu was a little fat man who dreamed of a military career, and Lord Buckingham simply could not be in love with the Queen of France. He loved men.
Dumas deliberately failed to mention that Queen Anne of Austria was married to Louis at the age of 14. The Queen gave birth to her first child only at the age of 40, 10 years after the adventures of the Three Musketeers.
Dumas invented all the adventures and biographies of his main characters. The prototype of Constance Bonacieux was his lover Belle Krelsimer. Chevalier d'Artagnan existed, but Dumas took only his surname from him. But the Musketeers Athos, Porthos, and Aramis were not there. The only true character in the novel is Milady. However, this woman could not have spoiled the life of the Queen in the 17th century. She just lived 2 centuries later.
The real Milady was a contemporary of Dumas. He could even meet her on the streets of Paris. Dumas knew that the famous swindler Jeanne de Lamotte was born in 1756 in a poor Parisian neighborhood. However, she had royal blood in her veins. Jeanne was an illegitimate descendant of the French King Henry of Valois. Her parents received a small annual allowance from the French crown, but the family was constantly hungry. When Jeanne's father died, her mother threw the girl out into the street. Now she had to earn her own living. The beggar, dressed in rags, ate garbage and begged for alms from passers-by.
At a young age, she had adventurous tendencies because she would go out to beg and ask, "Give to the descendant of the royal family of Valois."
Touched noblewomen willingly paid for the performances that the beggar woman arranged for them. Jeanne looked at these luxurious women in silks and jewelry and realized that she should be in their place. Jeanne de Valois, a noblewoman with royal blood. Once a French marquise heard the girl's story. Madame Boulainvilliers believed in the beggar's royal origin and decided to help her. She sent Jeanne to a nunnery for upbringing. But the girl did not find peace behind the high walls. The annoying instructions of the nuns made her bored, and instead she wandered the narrow streets for a long time and could spend hours looking at the windows of jewelry stores. During one of these walks, she met a young gendarme who called himself the Comte de Lamotte. He became infatuated with Jeanne, and they soon got married. And only after the wedding, she discovered that her husband, Count de Lamotte, was poor. Jeanne received only the title of count from him, but it's enough to get to Versailles. There she will be able to claim her rights as heir to the throne. In Versailles, she really got everything she wanted. In the royal palace, an unknown page hands her a letter that will change the Countess's life forever. It was an envelope with an invitation to a mystical session by a doctor of magic.
This session was called Dinner with the Spirits. Selected nobles gathered at a round table in a dark room of the castle. Next to each guest stood an empty chair and perfume utensils. The manager at this dinner was a tall man, Count Cagliostro, and Milady shuddered when he summoned the first spirit from the afterlife, her great-great-grandfather, King Henry of Valois.
The spirit pointed to the only representative of royalty in the room. It was Jeanne. No one knew if the mystical spirit of the dead king was just Count Cagliostro's fantasy. He saw Jeanne at court and unraveled her secret dream. He needed an assistant, and the adventurous nature of the Countess de Lamotte suited Cagliostro perfectly. After the session, Jeanne becomes a student and helps with seances. Cagliostro gave her lessons in math and astronomy, and most importantly, he perfected her innate art of deception.
Cagliostro taught her the basics of hypnosis and magic. And over time, the student will surpass the teacher. She will invent and execute the scam of the century, which will be called the Queen's Necklace. Its victims will be the king, the queen, and the cardinal, but not the ones Dumas wrote about in the adventures of the Musketeers.
At that time, France was ruled by 20-year-old Louis XVI. He did not like his young wife, the Austrian Marie Antoinette, and the Queen hated Cardinal Louis de Rogan. She constantly complained about him to Ludovic. Therefore, Rogan dreamed of establishing a relationship with the Queen at any cost. Rogan asked for help from the doctor of magic Cagliostro himself, and he introduced the Cardinal to Jeanne de Lamotte. In a conversation with His Eminence, the Countess for some reason pretends to be a friend of the Queen. But why would she deceive the Cardinal? In the 18th century, Parisian jewelers produced an amazing piece of jewelry, a huge diamond necklace, which consisted of 629 stones. The necklace was incredibly expensive, 600,000 livres. It is now almost 20,000. Jeanne decided that she had to take possession of this treasure, but how? It was then that the sinister lady chose her first victim, a cardinal. He has enough money to buy this necklace. But how to make him give the money? Then the Countess comes up with a brilliant plan. She convinces de Rogan that the Queen wants to reconcile with him. And as a sign of friendship, the Cardinal will buy her a famous necklace.
At the time, the Queen did not have the money to buy this necklace. She had to refuse because she was told that the king needed the money to buy another ship for France, not a necklace.
The king refused his wife this gift. But Marie Antoinette continued to dream of owning this necklace. The whole court, including the cardinal, knows about this desire. That is why Jeanne managed to convince him so easily to buy a necklace for the queen. She informs the cardinal that the queen is seeking reconciliation. His Eminence is delighted. He is ready to pay dearly for it. But first he has to see the queen.
Jeanne arranged this meeting at midnight in the Jardin de Versailles, where Rogan met Marie Antoinette. The queen was in good humor. She laughed a lot and even allowed her hand to be kissed. The cardinal felt happy. He begged the queen for permission to give her a necklace. But the real Marie Antoinette never found out about it, because that evening it was not the queen who spoke to the cardinal, but a milliner very similar to her, who was bribed by the Countess de Lamotte.
The fake fashion queen Nicole Leger was simply drunk by Jeanne. The Countess put a hat with a veil on her head and ordered her not to reveal her face at the meeting. The cardinal did not suspect anything. The very next day, de Rogan bought a necklace and gave it to Jeanne. He did not realize that the Countess was not even going to hand him over to the Queen. The swindler keeps the jewelry for herself. She disassembles the necklace into stones and divides the money from the sale of the diamonds with Cagliostro, and she buys a new life for herself. Jeanne moves into her own house, gets a large staff of servants, hires crews, and dresses in the latest fashions. But why did the Countess not flee Paris? She hoped that the Cardinal would not dare to ask the Queen about the necklace. And she was wrong. Rogan came to Marie Antoinette and asked her directly why she was not wearing his gift. The necklace scam has been solved.
The Queen is outraged. He appeals to the king and arrests are made. Cardinal de Rogan, Count Cagliostro, and Jeanne are arrested.
The Queen has been defamed. To clear her of the slander, Louis demands a public hearing. The case is considered by 64 judges who decide Cagliostro to be expelled from France, the Cardinal to be stripped of all his titles and sent away from Paris, and the swindler, Jeanne de Lamotte, to be sentenced to life imprisonment, publicly flogged and branded.
1786 Paris. A crowd gathers on Grevskaya Square to watch the public punishment of the legendary French swindler Jeanne de Lamotte. The woman is tied to a post and her left shoulder is exposed. She resists to the last, but eventually loses consciousness. The job is done. An 8-centimeter-long lily has baked on Jeanne's left shoulder. Today it would even be fashionable, but back then it was a shameful stigma for fraudsters and expensive prostitutes. It remained with her for the rest of her life.
When Jeanne came to, she was already in a prison cell at the Bastille. Then the Countess made a firm decision. She would take revenge on her enemies, the King and Queen. But how can you punish your enemies from prison? Jeanne finds a way out. She writes her memoirs, and in them she comes up with her own version of the story of the necklace. In her memoirs, she is an innocent victim who was framed by a cruel queen and used by a cardinal. Surprisingly, everyone believed Jeanne. Her book was a huge success. It undermined the reputation of the royal family.
Among the nobility, it was considered a sign of good manners to visit the disgraced countess and to express their disrespect for the French queen, whom no one loved.
Secret preparations for a coup d'état began. 3 years later, the French Revolution took place in France. King Louis and his wife were beheaded in the same square where Joan had been branded before. The swindler won again. She still has the diamonds from the necklace. With the help of her admirer, she organizes a prison break.
Disguised as a man, she flees to England, and it is believed that in England a web of hoaxes begins. She allegedly died in England.
The Countess did not live long in London. She felt that the police were watching her. I had to disappear. Then Jeanne throws herself out of the window of a London tavern. The funeral of the famous adventurer caused a stir. Many people followed her coffin. Among them was a strange woman in a black dress and a veil hat. She cried by the coffin for a long time, wailing loudly and crying bitterly. And no one even thought that Jeanne de Lamotte was mourning herself at this ceremony. There is still a cemetery in London and her grave, but her coffin is empty. She faked her own death so well that no one would even suspect her of deception. Jeanne de Lamotte was resurrected only 20 years later.
However, under a different name. Now she calls herself the Countess de Gaucher. Together with Count Cagliostro, Milady Jeanne arrives in St. Petersburg.
In St. Petersburg, Alexandre Dumas grants Jeanne an audience. The king found out the Countess de Gaucher was impersonating someone else. And then Jeanne revealed herself to the Russian Tsar. He offers the Countess to accept Russian citizenship and leave St. Petersburg forever. Alexander is sure that this is the only way he will be able to protect this woman.
At that time, Alexander I was conducting peace negotiations with France, and when he was asked if there was such a woman in Russia, he answered, "Definitely not." Then she was offered to settle in Tavria province in the Crimea, in a remote province, and Alexander I promises to take her under protection.
An unknown old woman settled in this house. No one saw her here during the day. She would come back at midnight, and the light in her window would stay on until the morning. The locals were whispering fearfully, "There is a demon with a woman's face in the devil's house."
She chose a reclusive lifestyle. But what did she really do? It turns out that Jeanne's nature won out here as well. In Crimea, she became the leader of smugglers. The small house, which the locals were afraid to approach, was perfect for the Countess. Nearby was a path that was used to smuggle contraband from the sea. We managed to find her. In the 18th century, they began to build a road here, but landslides and terrible landslides killed more than 50 mercenaries in the first week alone. The work was never completed, and the path was called the Cursed Countess Road.
She met illegals on the shore, always on horseback, always with 2 pistols and in a man's suit. Smugglers called her the Black Countess of Crimea. She was already 77 years old then.
Her unknown life in the Crimea was explored by a contemporary Ukrainian writer. Irene Rozdobudko found out why the old woman was called the Black Countess of Crimea.
She was just a smart, brave woman. Such women always irritate other women and less intelligent men. She was hated in the Crimean women's village for wearing a leather hat, for riding horses, for leading men.
Jeanne was too different from others. She lived modestly. Only the old maid and the boy who looked after the horses were with her. She spent all her time in the mountains. But one day, during a horse ride, the horse under the Countess broke down, and Jeanne could not hold on to the saddle. She barely got home, locked herself in her room, and started burning all the letters and documents. Then she put on a dress and ordered her maid not to change it after her death.
Her body was found in the morning. Jeanne was lying in a black satin dress with a high collar, buttoned up on all the buttons. But the maid did not fulfill the last request of the deceased. She decided to dress up as a countess, and when she took off her dress, she was horrified. A lily adorned the old woman's shoulder.
What this sign meant, the maid did not know. When the Countess died, the Russian secret police arrived in Crimea. They learned from the maid that before her death, the Countess de Lamotte was obsessed with some jewelry and would not part with the blue box.
After her death, there was great interest in her documents, which were kept in a blue casket, but no documents were found.
The blue box disappeared along with the papers. The Countess was buried in the cemetery in Stary Krim. We managed to find the place where this cemetery was located.
The famous French swindler was buried here. 4 people came to the funeral of the woman who shook half of Europe: an Armenian priest, a maid, and 2 Tatars, who lowered the coffin into the ground. A marble monument was placed on the grave. A white lily, the coat of arms and curse of a descendant of royal blood, Jeanne de Lamotte de Valois.
But where has the grave gone now? In the 19th century, it was discovered by the French journalist Alexis Bertrand. He was the first to reveal the truth about the death of the Countess in the Crimea. But the French authorities ridiculed this story because there was already a grave of Jeanne de Lamotte in London. In the 20th century, the philosopher Maximilian Voloshin, who lived in Crimea, also found Jeanne's grave in the local cemetery. But now it's gone.
It disappeared under strange circumstances. The stove was still there. This probably happened about 20-25 years ago. Archaeological excavations were carried out here at the time. In fact, all this was the beginning of historical and archaeological interest in the old Crimea.
We managed to find a unique photograph in the old Crimea. It depicts a tombstone with the Valois family coat of arms and a lily. There is also a half-erased inscription, Jeanne de Lamotte Valois. Locals claim that this grave disappeared in the 1970s, when the cemetery was demolished and replaced with a market square.
This was the last scam of the legendary Milady. Her documents and diaries were searched for 200 years, but the secret of Jeanne de Lamotte was not revealed even after her death. Along with the grave, the hope of finding the diamond necklace, the most precious jewelry of the French crown, disappeared.
The writer Alexandre Dumas made her the heroine of two of his novels, The Three Musketeers and The Queen's Necklace. These novels became instantly popular. But when the whole of Paris read them, no one suspected that Dumas's heroine was still alive. The world learned about Jeanne de Lamotte's death in Crimea only recently. She died at the age of 80 and took the secret of the royal lily with her forever.